All right, here we go. So here I have with me Dr. Dean Keith Simonton, who is a professor a Professor Emeritus at UC California, Davis, who is a renowned scholar in the fields of genius and creativity and leadership and a bunch of other things. And so, Dr. Simonton, thank you for joining me here.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Um, Dr. Simonton, first question here. So, 30 years ago, you wrote um, Sigmund Freud's bibliography consists of 330 articles and books. Thomas Edison wrote published, patented 1,093 different inventions. Balzac wrote for 15 hours a day for 20 years and wrote 85 novels as a consequence of it. Picasso created 20,000 works over the course of his career. Bach wrote enough to keep a copyist busy for an entire career working for a full week. And you, Dean Keith Simonton, you have in very short order, you will have published over 600 academic articles and 14 books. So what is driving you?
Well, first of all, um, that's over 50 years. So if you divide 600 by 50, you end up with uh, much, sorry about that. Um, I think it works out what, one a month, something like that.
Yeah.
And also, I have to be honest, some of those are pretty small. I mean, some of those are book reviews, for example, and movie reviews. And so, they come in a couple pages. On the other hand, some of them are massive. I have one book on great psychologists in their times. That's this big, huge tome. And it's my masterpiece, my magnum opus. And that took a lot of time to write. Just putting together all the research and I had to conduct original research of my own to put in there. So I guess the main thing that drives me is curiosity. There's so much we don't know about geniuses and major creators and major leaders. And what's interesting to me is a lot of this stuff has been around for a long, long time. People have been addressing these issues for ages. Like, for example, one of the debates I've dealt with is the genius versus Zeitgeist debate. How much of it is being the right person versus how much is it being at the right place at the right time? And of course, just like a lot of other issues, like the nature-nurture issue, it's not really an either-or phenomenon. And for example, one of my favorite papers looked at Napoleon's career. And what I wanted to do in that paper is pit Leo Tolstoy against Thomas Carlyle. Because Carlyle considers Napoleon one of the greatest figures in world history. He makes history. And then on the other hand, Tolstoy devotes his epilogue to his War and Peace to showing that Napoleon had no influence whatsoever on the battlefield. It was irrelevant. So I did this nifty little study where I looked at every single battle that he fought, and also every single battle fought by other French marshals. So they're using the same armies against the same enemies. And I found out that they were both right. That on the one hand, it was generally the case that whenever Napoleon was winning, his fellow French marshals were winning too. And whenever he was losing, they were losing too. So it was a matter of, who had the better armed forces at a particular time. But on the other hand, his victory rate was far greater than any of his French colleagues. So he was winning a larger percentage of battles, but whether or not he won or lost was dependent upon whether or not other French generals were winning or losing. I mean, one good example of that is his most famous loss was Waterloo.
Yep.
And one of the reasons why he lost Waterloo is one of his French generals lost a subsidiary battle where he was supposed to prevent the Prussian army from joining the British forces. And he failed. Well,
Yeah.
thanks to that, that meant Napoleon had to fight two armies instead of one, you know.
Yeah. That makes sense. And with the finding here, I think I'm actually familiar with the paper that you're talking about, although I don't think that I found it in this most recent review that I did of your work. It was the finding, it was 30% more, that the likelihood of Napoleon winning was about 30% more than the average French general. Was that the empirical finding
Yeah,
of,
something like
of
that.
that
Yeah.
paper? That's very cool. That's do you know Peter Turchin?
Pardon?
Peter Turchin, the historian.
Yeah.
He has a review of a bit of that work actually in a recent book that he wrote. That's
By,
extremely cool.
by the way, it threw me off because I haven't heard his name pronounced since graduate school.
Huh.
You know, he had an unusual fate because he kind of got I guess unfashionable is the word. Because he founded the sociology department at Harvard University, and he was a big name for a long, long time. But then when he started getting into really ambitious projects like social and cultural dynamics,
Yeah.
uh, that was going against the direction that sociologists wanted to go.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of big, kind of ambitious projects was not what they were interested in. They were trying to make sociology a science and more refined and focused and even quantitative. So anyway, I really appreciate you mentioning this because he's one of my heroes.
That's amazing. I wondered if there would be some connection there because you have parts of overlap between the two of you. Something that I find so interesting about your work also is that you're very much you also do, it seems, a fair bit of work that is not considerably fashionable.
Yeah,
A number of the I think a really interesting tension in your work is on one hand, making the claim that eminent creators matter, that what they have done, that they're not, as you say, like sort of merely the I don't know, an epiphenomenon of just like that, the time in which they live, but actually that they have material, that they have free will, people can be excellent, that the individuals matter, but also that people are flawed, and that you have this paper on Galileo, which I want to talk about just a bit, of sort of going through the ways that geniuses are also quite, there's a lot of hindsight bias that we have when looking at their work, that there's they misstep, they overstep, and we sort of simplify their lives, and that both of these things are true at the same time, that they matter, and also that they're errant. Can you just make the claim for anyone who might be skeptical of this that eminent people do in fact matter? Maybe talking a bit about Price's law, the Lotka curve, sort of however you want to come about it.
yeah. Well, I mean, the Lotka curve is a good illustration of that because we know that in any given field, a small percentage of the population in that field account for most of the work in that field. So, I mean, for example, take Mozart. 6% of all music performed in the classical repertoire is written by Mozart.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of classical composers. And for him to claim 6% is phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually 6.1%. And then Bach is 5.9%, and Beethoven is 5.9%. So they're both about, I mean, together, they're accounting for almost 20%.
Yeah.
So they completely dominate their field. And I mean, you mentioned earlier, the publication counts for various people, that it's not that Freud wrote the interpretation of dreams and then he sat on his ass for the rest of his life. He kept on publishing work after work after work. He would revise the work. He worked right up until civilization and its discontents. So they're constantly producing stuff, and a lot of it has an impact. Not all of it, but a lot of it has an impact. To get back to Mozart, he composed a lot of masterpieces, but he also composed a lot of mediocre stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually got a good example of this on the internet the other day. Somebody decided to post an interesting YouTube thing where they played all of Mozart's work, not all of Mozart's work, but they traced his music from Heroine, which was his very first work when he was 5 years old, to the Lacrimosa, which is Heroine, I think 630 or something like that, when he was 35, the year of his death. In fact, it was in his Requiem, and he didn't finish the Requiem. He died before he could finish it.
Okay.
In fact, I have a nice scene in Amadeus, the movie, about that. And they go all the way through, and some of the pieces are just mediocre. There are things that anybody in his day could compose, but he composed them. I don't know if he thought they were good or whether he thought he needed the money. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of, pièce de occasion in French, occasion pieces. And so, that accounts for some of the more mediocre works. Another example is Einstein. People are like, God, this guy's a genius. And he made contributions to so many different domains. When he was 26 years old, he composed published 4 works, any one of which he could have got a Nobel Prize for. He only got a Nobel Prize for one of them, the photoelectric effect. But he could have gotten it for Brownian motion. He could have got it for special relativity. He was just, it was an annus mirabilis. Well, here's something that people don't appreciate. He spent over the last 30 years of his life trying to come up with the unified field theory. Last 30 years of his life. He published one article after another, and then it would be shot down. His peers would say, Einstein, this is not going to work. And one reason why it wouldn't work is he didn't accept quantum theory. So he was trying to do a unified theory without quantum theory as part of it. But just to give you an example about how bad his unified theory was, one time he submitted it for publication, and one of the peer reviewers said, Einstein needs to realize that if his theory is correct, the universe wouldn't exist. That's a pretty bad failure as far as prediction is concerned. And the reason why it wouldn't exist is it didn't allow for the fundamental physical constants that govern the universe. And without the fundamental physical constants, you can't have the universe. So Einstein made a lot of terrible mistakes. And there was actually one final story about this. Is one time he was giving a talk, a seminar, and he's on the board and he's writing on the chalkboard all these equations. And he got very, very confused. And finally, somebody stepped up to the board, started erasing and redoing the boards. And they said, we've got to be sympathetic with Einstein. He is actually pre-Einsteinian. He couldn't even express his own theory. So they make a lot of mistakes too. But fortunately, they're very lucky because we usually ignore their mistakes. Einstein's work on unified field theory is seldom cited. They cite the relativity papers, right? And especially general relativity. And it's the same thing true for artists. All those mediocre works by Mozart, no one records, no one performs. All the works that are produced by Michelangelo or whoever, they end up in the basement of the museum, or they end up eventually getting destroyed. I mean, here's an example for Michelangelo. He painted this painting that was one time somewhat scandalous. It was Leda and the swan, and that comes from Greek mythology. The swan is actually Zeus, and he would take the form of various animals in order to seduce women. And so Leda was one of his seductions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so here's a swan and a very attractive woman making love. That painting has disappeared. And it disappeared because a lot of people thought it was trash. It was basically the Renaissance version of pornography.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
And it seems like even I was thinking even Newton is probably even a more extreme example of this of someone who made supreme accomplishments at an early time in his life and then seems to have squandered the rest of it and just basically focused on numerology and I don't know
astrology
just
and the interpretation of the Book of Revelations.
yeah. So okay, so a point of I don't know, criticism maybe that I want to lob or get your response to about this that I was thinking. If we think about, so undoubtedly it seems so with reference to the Lotka curve that that the mode for the number of books that a given author will publish is one, and then there are a couple of Stephen Kings who
Those are
publish
the people who contributed to the field. It's one. Yeah. I mean, another way of saying that is that one-hit wonders are the norm in most fields.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Or one, yeah. That makes sense. But there's also, I mean, there's an additional thing going on here where it seems that within creative domains there is a winner take all dynamic that's going on. So if we compare like Watson and Crick to Linus Pauling, for example, both of them probably at the time were similarly prolific, were similarly adept, on the same kind of research program. If it hadn't been for Watson and Crick, my understanding is that within a couple of months or years, like Linus Pauling would have similarly determined the structure of DNA. But no one knows who Linus Pauling is. No one has any idea. And so there's a winners take all dynamic where there's only so much cultural room to refer to classical composers or to refer to painters or to refer to scientists. And so the influence that Bach or Mozart or Beethoven have undoubtedly they made enormous contributions, but in the actual them taking up 20% of the total repertoire of currently published music. I don't know if that was the metric that you used, but that they actually people have so much more of an outsized influence with historical hindsight than they otherwise should.
Right.
How do you think about that sort of sociological dimension of a winner take all dynamic that's selected?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a very important point. In economics, they actually call this the star syndrome or something like that. And that is that, or in sociology, it's sometimes called cumulative advantage, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
Yep.
And there's no doubt that that happens. Beethoven's reputation is exaggerated. There are a lot of other great composers of his time that composed really nice works, including some of his students. The Archduke Rudolph composed some really nice compositions. That was one of his students. Or Ferdinand Ries composed some really nice works. And some of it even sounds like Beethoven. In fact, Beethoven criticized a student. He says, "You sound too much like me. You got to start sounding like yourself," And what's kind of interesting to me is there's a movement, at least on classical music stations, to dig up these people and perform them on the air. And there's some really amazing discoveries. Now, sometimes you listen to it and you say, okay, that's a good piece. I listened to it once. I don't have to listen to it again, But other times, there are people who are overlooked that should not be overlooked, and they should be part of the classical repertoire. And the best example of that I can think of now is Florence Price, who was an African-American female. So she had two things going against her.
Mm.
She was phenomenally precocious. She actually graduated from high school at 14.
Mm.
So she fit the profile of the precocious, Mozartian type genius.
Mm-hmm.
But she had a liability. And that liability, that she was an African-American and she was female. She won some awards. Her first symphony won a major award, and it was the first work by an African-American female, composed by performed by a major symphony orchestra. And she had other successes. She went to leading conservatories. I mean, she had everything going for her, but that one or two things, her race and her gender. And so what happened to her? She disappeared, just vanished.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day, somebody bought a rundown house in Illinois, south of Chicago.
Mm.
And they found these boxes and boxes of manuscripts, music manuscripts.
Mm.
And they realized they were all by Florence Price. And almost all of them had never been performed. She was like Franz Schubert, very similar to Franz Schubert.
Mm.
And so a number of orchestras, starting with the Fort Smith Symphony Orchestra, started performing this stuff. And they said, this is good. She's got 4 symphonies. Well, one of them's missing. She got 4 symphonies, or 3 that are extant. And then 2 violin concertos. She's got lots of piano pieces. And they all are worth listening to. They have to be part of regular repertoire. They have to be recorded. Quite frankly, I'd rather listen to her than George Gershwin.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's overrated.
Mm-hmm.
So fortunately, as long as they leave something behind where they can undergo a revival,
mm-hmm.
and allow posterity to judge whether or not they are neglected geniuses. And Florence Price, to me, is a neglected genius. As long as they leave something behind so they can have a revival, then it's okay. Unfortunately, in some domains, it's hard to leave things behind. You can leave behind music scores, you can leave behind unpublished novels, a whole bunch of the poems, all that kind of stuff. It's really tough when you are in an area like sculpture,
mm-hmm.
where your sculptures take up a lot of room.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a tendency for somebody doing inventory saying, well, we haven't shown this stuff for a long, long time. Maybe it's time to, do some kind of garage sale or whatever.
Yeah.
And then it disappears. And it may end up in somebody's, living room or whatever. A good example of that is Judy Chicago, a feminist artist. And she does some really large scale stuff. And one of the things that she did was called I think it's called The Banquet. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. And I actually saw this. It was exhibited in the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco one time. It takes up a whole room, big whole room in itself. It's a big banquet table. And on that table are place settings that have the names of all the famous women in history. I think it goes back to Hypatia, the great Hellenistic mathematician, astronomer, et cetera, polymath.
Yep.
And it's really, really impressive. It's ceramic, the place settings. It does have one liability, and that is all the place settings are vaginal imagery. And while we're used to having penile or phallic imagery in art, vaginal imagery is less common. Mm-hmm. Maybe George O'Keeffe has some and whatever. And I don't know why. I mean, they're both human genitals, right? I mean, what difference does it make? But in any case, it's big, and some people find it offensive, and it's a very, very bold statement, and it's also very instructive because some of the names she comes up with are not very widely known, like Carolyn Herschel, for example, who was William Herschel's sister, who made major discoveries in the area of comets.
Mm-hmm.
And but a lot of people don't know her. Well, it's like a lot of people don't know who Apache is as far as that goes. So
Yep.
it's educational too. So I remember reading one time there was a debate about getting rid of all of these crates that had this artwork of hers, her magnum opus, I think, when it hadn't been exhibited in a long time. Is it time to get rid of it? And there's one another example of that, and that is Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher and mathematician, along with Alfred North Whitehead, wrote this great book. It's considered to be a masterpiece in mathematical logic, and the Principia, and it's just an incredible magnum. What they basically tried is reduce all logic to mathematics, using symbolic math, and
to reduce all math to logic, right?
All math to logic,
yeah.
All math is logical, and it's in a very, very impressive book, very, very intimidating. You open up every page, and all there are these logical and mathematical symbols, right?
Yeah, it's 1,000 pages of it.
What?
And it's 1,000 pages of it.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
And Bertrand Russell once asked towards the end of his life if he had any recurrent nightmares. And he says, yes, I have one recurrent nightmare. And that is that it's in the library, and there's a guy who is walking up and down the aisles looking for books that no one checks out. And he pulls my and Whitehead's book out, blows the dust off it, and he's thinking about putting it in the basket. And then he always wakes up before he finds out what the guy does.
Okay.
And sometimes we have examples, or even for books, where you think they could be, saved forever. Sometimes even books disappear.
Yeah. There's the book The Swerve. I forget the name of the author, but it's about the discovery of Lucretius's book that on the nature of things,
Right.
of which there was only a single copy of it which survived, and then was discovered in sort of the early Renaissance, and from there
a lot of the ancient books, ancient Greeks, are still only known through the Arabic translations. Because the Arabs published, under Islam, and particularly the House of Wisdom in the Abbasid Caliphate, they systematically ordered all the wisdom of the world, not just Greek, but of Persian and Sanskrit and so forth, to be translated into Arabic. And there's a lot of works we only know through Arabic. And Aristotle, apparently, most of Aristotle are lecture notes that his students took. And that's why
okay.
And that's why he doesn't read very well. I don't know if he was really, that bad of a writer, but a lot of it's just lecture notes. And I'm now retired, but I know my lecture notes are not worth publishing.
Right. So this speaks to the importance of a sort of an aspect of creative work that it's when the work that you do is more easily distillable into a material object that is easily reproduced.
Another thing is you develop a following. This is really, really crucial. Like, I just saw a book review about a book that just came out on how to become famous. And one of the main points that the author makes is it really helps to have a following. So sometimes you have examples of people that nothing really survives except via their followers. Pythagoras, we don't have a single work surviving by him, but
Socrates.
He formed a school, and that kept him, him going. And so having that impact lasts. Now what that says is that that's another disadvantage that neglected geniuses have, is they don't get a following to keep them alive, to hold them over the hump until their stuff can start being republished and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I interrupted you, so go ahead.
No, this is wonderful. Why don't we, I want to get, so there's something that that I very much want your take on, and I want to make sure that we get to. Do you have thoughts on, thinking about sort of population centers historically that have produced a great deal of thought, whether that's the Florentine Renaissance or like Edinburgh or Vienna, or sort of name your favorite golden age. Each of these population centers is so much smaller than any modern population center. And yet it seems that the contributions that they're making are quite outsized. What's your what is your best explanation?
Well, first of all, when we talk about the populations being small, we're talking about relative to our time. I think, for example, Athens had a population of during the golden age of like 35,000. I think that was 35,000 citizens, not because you don't count the slaves, right?
Yep.
They're not in there. And in any case, whatever the exact number is, that may be small for now. In fact, I think the town I'm in right now, Davis, California, has about 35,000. Okay.
Right.
And we are no Athens. I mean, we got a lot of intellects here, but we are no Athens. But relative to their time, they were pretty heavily populated. Athens had a larger population than Sparta, for example. Okay. And it was not just that they had a large population. They had heavy immigration from other parts of the Greek world, Greek civilization. It became known as a hotspot. So that, I mean, a good example is Aristotle did not come from Athens. He was not an Athenian. He came from northern Greece. I think it was Stagira or something like that. And he just happened to want to become a pupil of Plato. Plato was a native Athenian. And so he, became a student, and later they broke away and he founded his own academy, Lyceum. And so he was an immigrant, okay? And Athens attracted a lot of people that way, a lot of intellects. And so it became kind of a hotbed of philosophy, of architecture, of sculpture, painting too, although unfortunately most of that doesn't survive, But I mean, there's some really phenomenal examples where Athens just basically sucked up the geniuses from Ionia and Egypt and so forth. But it's not just importing, it's being open to the major contributions of other civilizations. So, and that was part of Greek civilization in general that you saw. They started borrowing from Persian civilization, from Egyptian civilization. A lot of their architecture and sculpture, when you look at it in its early stages, is very imitative of their neighbors. But then they took it in a totally new direction. And part of, of course, is they had to, because they had different gods, for example. So, their main god had to be Zeus, and So that automatically shifted everything over. And so the point is that if you look at every one of these places, they're often like Athens. They are pulling in genius from all around. Vienna is another example. Beethoven was not Viennese. Beethoven was born and raised in Bonn on the Rhine. But he knew that if you were a composer, that Vienna was where it was at. And so, in fact, that's mostly Vienna's contribution, at least at the time of Beethoven. Later on, they made contributions to philosophy and the arts and so forth. But in Beethoven's time, Vienna was primarily known for music. And so it was natural that he would be gravitated there. Or another example, in a later generation, is Johannes Brahms. He was from Hamburg. And so where does he end up? He ends up in Vienna, okay? Because that's where it's at. You know, that's the it place. And of course, we have the same thing happening in New York, or it happened in Berlin between the wars. You know, there's these places that become magnets that attract genius from outside, so that per capita output is very disproportionate to their population. And I should say a part of that is, and this is something gets back to what we said earlier, they have an audience in certain places. There's an audience that goes to concert. There's an audience that goes to opera. And so you have people who will listen to you and who will commission works from you. And so Vienna had, you know, great opera, had great orchestras, great chamber works. And so having that audience is extremely important as well for establishing your fame. So if you look at them, you shouldn't really look at the population. You should look at the per capita output, allowing for all the input they're getting. They're sucking out of their environments, really.
Yeah. And
by the way, it's a two-way street. There's actually a great article. I edited this book called The Handbook of Genius. And there's this great article in there by an economist. One of the major fields that I think is really cool is, that didn't exist when I was a graduate student, is a field called cultural economics. They actually have a journal called the Journal of Cultural Economics. And what they're interested in is creativity, like I am, but of course, more of the economic side and the materialistic side. And the author did this fascinating study where we all know that Paris became a place that attracted artists from all over the world. I mean, you know, especially from other places in Europe, like Spain. You know, Picasso ended up in Paris, and from Italy, from England. We had a number of American artists end up in Paris, you know, like Whistler. And so what she asked was an interesting question. We all know that Paris attracted a lot of artists, but did the artists benefit from that? Did they benefit from living in Paris and, you know, visiting the coffee houses with, you know, fellow artists and exhibiting at the same salons and things like that? And she found they did. They produced better work when they moved, after they moved to Paris.
Yep.
Of course, I should say better work by the economist criterion, and that is how well they do in auctions.
Okay. Okay.
So a painting by Picasso painted in Paris does better in auction than a painting done in Malaga or whatever.
Oh, interesting. So for a single artist, when a work that is produced in a more population dense or culturally dense location, that individual work is actually of higher quality.
Right.
Wow. Oh, interesting. Really interesting.
And of course, part of that is it is such a stimulating place to be. Like I said, you're rubbing elbows with all the greatest artists of the period, and that's you know.
That's interesting. That seems to you have other work showing that the so if you look at like the creative output of an individual over the course of their life, there's of course fluctuation. It follows a curve where when you first enter a field, there's a rapid ramp up phase where um, you're contributing your peak output after a small number of years, and then you have sort of a slow decline. But you also have other work showing that this is the autoregressive simplex
Yeah,
model.
all right.
Is that what this is?
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Do you mind just saying that, I mean the what I took from that is that if essentially just looking at that a person's like creative potential is a latent characteristic about that person that is
Right,
consistent across their
exactly.
lifespan. That I think that seems to conflict, it sort of like has an interesting tension with what you just said, that there's a more proximal um, influence of environmental factors where you can have a person who has maybe a large latent creative capacity, but when they go to a place that is culturally dense, that that then like marks like the peak of their career. Is that just these are just two independent parameters that are both like
Well,
influencing
I mean, first of
the
all,
model?
that's the classic nature nurture issue, right?
Mhm.
And for me, this is like a lot of issues in psychology. This is a false dichotomy, okay? Because what we can show, for example, for sure, is the environment has a major impact on the appearance of geniuses, creative geniuses, and
Mhm.
also political geniuses, military geniuses, and so forth. For example, we'll never know what great Napoleons never showed up in the annals of history because there was never a war. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you can't make history teaching at the military school.
Mhm.
And so there's no doubt that the context is important, and it's important two ways. First of all, when you're young, growing up in a very intellectually or culturally stimulating environment, um, allows you to actualize your potential more. Okay, so you are able to achieve more with, in a sense, achieve more with less. Given the same genetic base, you're going to be better off if you develop that base, that talent, in a very stimulating environment. And it's not just when you're young, it's also, because that gets back to what that article I mentioned earlier, or chapter talked about, it's also your contemporaries too. I've done research showing that highly creative people live in environments where they have lots of contemporaries who are creative in the same domain. They may be rivals or they may be collaborators, but they are working in the same domain, often stimulating each other, like Braque and Picasso stimulating each other in the development of analytical cubism, for example. And they're painting side by side, I mean, talk about
Mhm.
stimulation. Um, so what you have is you have environmental influence on top of a genetic base. But guess what? That genetic base doesn't disappear, because in any given cohort, we get back to what we said before, there's tremendous variation in impact. So those people who have the biggest impact not only had the most favorable environmental circumstances, but also had the most favorable genetic substrate, if you will. So they're
Yeah.
both important. I mean, there's no doubt, for example, that Mozart was ideally suited to become the
Yep.
genius that he was. His father was a notable composer himself and violinist, and even wrote a textbook on violin playing.
Mhm.
And then he had a sister, Nannerl, who was also a great keyboardist. In fact, they used to do duets together when they
Mhm.
tour. And so he lived in a home that was surrounded by music. His father was always exposing him to the latest compositions, the most fashionable compositions of the day. A lot of people don't realize this, but the first three piano concerti of Mozart were essentially given to him by his father as homework.
Right.
They were actually, he was given these compositions by other composers. Most of them were, I think, just plain ordinary piano pieces. And he says, make a piano concerto out of this. And so his first three piano concerti were just basically transcriptions of other composers' work. And then, of course, later on, he discovered Haydn and became tremendously influenced by Haydn, particularly in string quartets and symphonies. And so he was ideally suited, both genetically and environmentally, become the great composer he was, and much more so than Beethoven even. Beethoven had some musical background. His father was a minor musician in the Bonn Court Orchestra. I forget what instrument he played. But anyway, a relatively minor musician. And he also had a problem with alcoholism, which undermined, in fact, eventually was fired. In fact, it's interesting that biographers were so embarrassed about the lack of talent in Beethoven's family that there's a rumor that he's an illegitimate grandson, I think it is, not quite sure of this, of Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was not only a flautist, but also composed a lot of great concerti for the flute. There's no evidence for that, but they had to say there's got to be more genes behind Beethoven. But he also wasn't as precocious as Mozart. In fact, for a long time, he thought he was 2 years younger than he actually was, because his father lied about his age to try to make him seem more like a Mozart. And it wasn't until later, when he had a legal problem, and he needed his birth certificate. So somebody went back to Bonn, get the right one, because there's an earlier one. And the guy came back and says, there is no earlier one. You are 2 years older than you thought you were.
Yeah.
So the point is, so both genes and environment are operating simultaneously.
Right. I've heard this distinction between an orchid and a dandelion. That like the orchid is like Mozart is like the like paragon of the orchid. Like it's this beautiful flower, but it just requires like a whole lot of nurturing to get it to get it to bloom in exactly the way that you want it to be bloomed from like the earliest days of its exposure. Whereas a dandelion is that which sort of grows in whichever environment you put it in. And so, a canonical example of the dandelion would be like Ben Franklin or Da Vinci, Ramanujan. And like, it seems like thinking about those cases, it seems like Ben Franklin would have been successful wherever he was put down. Aside from, I mean, there are extreme. You can imagine like extreme circumstances where anyone would atrophy, obviously, but within a normal range of environmental experience, he was going to be interesting. Ramanujan the same way. I mean, we can kind of go through these people. Do you think there's a meaningful distinction between the dandelion orchid thing, or is it just in the case of Mozart that he had a domineering father who set him on a path, like recognized he was precocious, he was a prodigy clearly, and pushed him in that direction? But it seems likely, you tell me, do you think, I mean, it seems like he probably would have been good at doing other things also.
Right. Well, this actually gets back to a major issue, and that is we know that general intelligence is largely inherited, not completely. The percentage that's often posted inheritability is 80%. And then the 20% left is environmental. Whatever, it's more than 50%. But we also know that intelligence can be broken down to sub-intelligences. into factors. And that these also have their separate inheritabilities. And when you have someone like a polymath, like obviously Franklin was a polymath, it's very likely that they probably inherited not only general intelligence, but general verbal intelligence, spatial intelligence, social intelligence, all of them. It's really hard. Well, actually, there's an area where Franklin would have been in bad straits. If he was born in an environment where his only opportunities were those of Mozart, namely music.
Didn't he invent an instrument though?
He invented the glass harmonica.
Yeah.
But he couldn't really play it very well. He composed a string quartet, but it only uses open strings on the instruments. And it's a monstrosity. And so I don't think he could have been a musician. But obviously he could have done anything in science, literature, philosophy. I mean, you name it, if it's verbal or spatial or social. I mean, even his autobiography shows a lot of social intelligence.
Clearly. Yeah.
I mean, he was a wise guy. He was a wise guy partly because he made a lot of mistakes. I mean, he even says what some of his big mistakes like was one time when he tried to seduce his best friend's girlfriend. That was a big mistake. Sometimes wisdom is earned in a difficult way. But to get back to your question, I think a lot of people, not a lot of people, but some people are born with a wide range of abilities that can blossom in almost anything. So they could be a dandelion. I don't think Mozart could have done anything more than music. I mean, he was literate, but he was innumerate. He wasn't very deep when it came to philosophy. Beethoven was much deeper when it came to, philosophical issues.
They could have come as a consequence of him just focusing from such an early age on music, though. Like if he hadn't been exposed so completely to music from a young age, he may well have. He probably could have learned math perfectly well, or have he would have read.
It could be. But the thing is that the thing about any kind of talent, whether it's mathematical talent or musical talent or whatever, is it's usually an asymptote. And what that means is that at the beginning, you benefit from deliberate practice. That's the big word in the field, deliberate practice. Anders Ericsson became famous for that. And so you gain a lot at the beginning. If you just practice. And if you're not gaining very much, then you're not probably practicing it enough. So you have to practice harder and longer. Okay. But eventually, a lot of people discover, for me, I discovered it when I was learning guitar, is I have to practice more and more and improve less and less. The law of diminishing returns. And it became particularly problematic when I'd see somebody who practiced less than I did get better. I had a friend, a best friend at one time, and he asked me to show what the lesson I got for that day. Each week I went for guitar lessons, and I get a homework assignment to practice, and he'd ask me to show him what I had to learn. And I'd already worked at it a little bit, some little thing like this, or chord progression, or whatever, a riff, and he'd always do it better in less time. I hated him, absolutely hated him. And he was also the same way in sports. I got a trampoline, and I would try to learn new tricks, And then he'd come over and I'd show him how to do a trick. And then he'd do it right away.
Yep.
You know, I mean, there was some learning curve. So the first time he did it was awkward. And then after a while, he got much better than I was doing it, you know, with fewer, you know, trials. So, so there is an asymptote. And so maybe Mozart could have been given a lot of math training, but he might have reached an asymptote. I mean, compare that to Pascal,
Mm-hmm.
who had obviously a talent for mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a little kid, found out that his father had a library that was filled with mathematical books, particularly Euclid, you know,
Mm-hmm.
ancient Greek, you know, and Archimedes and so forth. And so he started reading Euclid, and his father found out and got very upset.
Mm-hmm.
Says, math is not the way to go. He himself was a lawyer. You should be reading literature. You should be reading the classics, you know, Greek and Latin classics and all this kind of stuff. And so he took away all the math books. So what does Pascal do? He starts inventing geometry where he left off, and added additional theorems. It got up to, I think, the 36th, 37th theorem in Euclidean geometry. He invented his own terminology to do it.
Yeah.
But I mean, that goes beyond talent. You know, that's
yeah.
where, I mean, it's just, you know, you probably know about the contemporary Terence Dow. Terence Dow is just as precocious in mathematics. It was absolutely phenomenal. He's going to school, you know, at extremely young age, taking college courses, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And so talent will usually manifest itself where you don't have that asymptote. These people learn so quickly, and they show such a passion. It's not just learning, intellectual learning, it's how much they love the field that they're going into.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Mozart would have done that. I really don't.
Yeah. I mean, this is super interesting. You have this other part of your work, though, your multiplicative theory of, I don't know if that's the name exactly that you call it, the multiplicative theory of creativity, that if you have, you know, if some creative capacity requires 5 different traits, if you don't have one of them, then essentially that negates the other 4 that you do have.
Right.
And that there's like, you have this discussion of late bloomers. So, you know, there are people like Grandma Moses is, you know, an extreme example of someone who had a whole career at the end of her life. Is that a do you think about child prodigies? Is a way of thinking about child prodigies just that what they tend to be prodigious in are skills that require a very small number of skill. They require extremely pronounced and very few skills, whereas these
yeah, I mean, if you look
bloomers,
at obviously, if you look where child prodigies are most likely to appear, they appear in well-defined, finite domains. I mean, I know for some people, they would feel that music is not finite, it's infinite, but it's really kind of finite. You know, you get to a point where you learn how to compose music, you learn how to perform an instrument, and everything else beyond that is very, very incremental.
mm-hmm.
Oh, you may learn a new fingering or you know, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So all the domains where you're most likely to have child prodigies are those kinds of domains. So you have music, for example. You have mathematics. Trying to think if there's another one. Can you think of another?
Chess.
Oh, chess. Yeah, I mean, chess is even more of an example because of you can't get hardly. Well, I mean, I know there's an infinite number of games you can play, but it's still a finite board. The rules are always the same. Each piece is restricted in how it can move.
Yep.
So it's still a well-defined, relatively finite domain, and you can master it so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it doesn't take long. You know, to get back to that concept of deliberate practice. Part of that concept has the notion of the 10-year rule,
mm-hmm.
or this is sometimes expressed as the 10,000 hour rule.
Yep.
They're actually pretty much the same thing, just a mathematical conversion. But anyway, the 10-year rule only applies on the average. And there's some people who take a lot less than 10 years.
Mhm.
I mean, Mozart was amazing. He one thing that's amazing about Mozart, he was the first child prodigy that had an actual scientific study published about him in the Transactions of the Royal Society of London, which at that time was the premier scientific journal. Very first. He was doing a tour in London, you know, playing the keyboard, and he was only 8 years old at the time. So he's too young for the 10-year rule to apply, particularly since he didn't start at age 0. He started at age 3. So it was actually 5 years that he was already a professional pianist. And so the scientists asked if he could do some studies in their hotel room. And one of the things he did is he asked Mozart to use sight reading, for example. And you could give Mozart any composition you'd never seen before, and he'd just do it. He was incredible sight reader. And in fact, one time during this interview, Mozart was asked to do a duet with his father, Leopold, a piano duet, or piano four hands. And Leopold kept on making mistakes. And Mozart kept on giving him the side eye. Come on, Dad, you can do this. So Mozart is already better than a professional musician at 8 years old. Now, a lot of people didn't believe that Mozart was 8, but this guy gave 2 bits of evidence. One is he actually went to Vienna and dug up the birth certificate and showed that Mozart was, in fact, born January 27th, 1756. January 27th is when I was born. So Mozart is my birthday saint or whatever.
I see.
And but in addition, what this interviewer noticed is that the second Mozart got away from the keyboard, he became 8 years old. So like a little kitty came into the room, and he was supposed to be playing music, and he really stopped and started petting the kitty. And there was a hobby horse in the room that his father got him to use as a toy. And every once in a while, he just get up and start pop, 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 pop. So in terms of social development, he was 8 years old.
There's a very funny video of Magnus Carlsen, the chess player, doing the same thing. He's playing Garry Kasparov, and he'll make a move, and then he's just drinking orange juice and looking around like this kind of tired and this 8-year-old who's just kind of totally bored with what's going on.
Well, he also violates the 10-year rule by far. Because if I remember correctly, he picked up chess relatively late. He had no interest in it. Yeah, early. And I forget who it was. It might have been his father or a friend or whatever. Said you should, try playing chess. And he just had a knack for it. And he fell in love with it. But he got a late start. And then he's already a grandmaster at a younger age than he's supposed to be, And unless you count the recent scandalous episodes, he's never lost a match. I mean, that's astonishing. So to get back to the original point, talent is very specific, and because of what you said before, it's multiplicative, and there's some domains where there is a missing piece of the puzzle that prevents you from finding out what your real thing is. And that's why a lot of people in certain domains, like for example, in fiction, like novels, for example, you're usually in your 20s before you really start demonstrating a talent in fiction. Even poetry, which is relatively young, the youngest poet on record is Chatterton, Thomas Chatterton, and he committed suicide at 19. And so you could say that he's the most child prodigy you get in literature is basically 18 is when he did his fraudulent work, his Raleigh poems. And so he discovered his talent relatively late. There were probably pieces that he was already developing. I mean, he was always very good at English, probably at a young age, but poetry requires some additional stuff, some additional awareness of the meanings and sounds of words, the semantic content and the musical content of individual English words. And so it took a while to click in. Now, you mentioned a really great example, Grandma Moses. What happened for her is that she was in the wrong domain. She was doing with a crochet or whatever it is, and very fine needlework, and she did very fine stuff. And if you look at that, you can see a lot of it has echoes in her later paintings. She only did one actual painting. She did a painting where she did a headstand for a bed and did something on it. But that's the only example where she actually did a painting. It was a very minor thing. But then she got arthritis. And she couldn't do this fine needlework anymore. And I think it was an older sister or something who said, well, you can hold a brush in your hand and paint. Just like Matisse did later on. He had turbo arthritis. And so he held brushes, on ends of sticks. And so she started painting just because that's all she could do. Well, the interesting thing is, it turns out that painting was actually better for her. It was a more natural thing for her to do because she didn't have the constraints of sticking to a rectilinear pattern in her coloration. She could do whatever she wanted. So she could start playing around with form. She could start playing around with nuances of shade, all these things that she couldn't do before. So there were probably skills that were latent in her that were stifled because she was in the wrong medium. And then all of a sudden they could develop.
Is there any way in which the skills that she developed when she was when she was sewing or doing crochet, is there any way that skill set transferred to her painting?
Well, yeah, a lot of it did.
Otherwise?
A lot of it.
Yeah.
Certainly subject matter did. She basically did Americana. I mean, that's what she did,
Yeah.
And that's why she ended up on a postage stamp. One of her paintings ended up on a postage stamp. That's why there's a painting by Grandma Moses in the White House hanging on the wall, because she did Americana. She did picnics in the park and that kind of stuff on 4th of July. And in fact, I think that's actually one of her most famous paintings is the 4th of July. But the point is that she didn't acquire new subject matter so much as she was able to express herself better in the new medium and developed expression, made it more expressive than it could be in her old medium, where there was just too much constraint to it. It's just like a composer who comes to the realization that, like Schumann, he says, I can't compose piano music anymore. It's too constraining. It's time for chamber music. And then finally he goes, it's time for symphonies. And even with symphonies, his first symphonies, Schumann composed on the piano. And then he says, this is dumb. I should compose a symphony directly on the score. So I forget which one he switched over. It might have been number 2. So you have to realize that you often have, for a given medium of expression, inbuilt constraints.
Right.
And you even have in the sciences. Einstein was working on certain problems, and he said, what if I just make a different set of assumptions? And one of the biggest assumptions in his day was there was absolute space and time. And that goes back to Newton. That's one of the areas where Newton was wrong. Okay.
Yep.
And he says, what if space and time is relative? And they're not just relative to each other, but there's trade-offs between them. So you can trade space for time and time for space. I mean, that's mind-boggling when you think about it. Absolutely mind-boggling. And so he develops relativity theory. And then, wow, what are the implications? Well, if you're moving at a faster speed, you trade space for time, so time goes slower when you're going faster. I mean, that's cool. And that's why astronauts actually live longer if they spend more time orbiting in space. They actually did a comparison. They had 2 identical twin astronauts. One is actually a senator in Arizona now. And I think one of them is now like 1 nanosecond older than the other. I don't know what the exact figure is, but
Right. But for that second that you gain, your body atrophies, which probably isn't actually
the
trade-off you would want to make.
So yeah, they don't get much exercise up there.
Wonderful. Okay, Dr. Simonton, I just have two last questions for you, and then I I appreciate your time so much. The first question, the first of them is, why have you published or co-published so little?
That's a good question. I've co-authored a lot more recently, and some of my best stuff is actually co-authored. And the best example, and I think the funnest example, is I published a study back in 1985. It was a mathematical model of the relationship between intelligence and leadership. And it was actually a series of four mathematical models that were nested in each other, of increasing complexity to handle more complex situations. Okay. And I single-authored that. I single-authored it because I couldn't find anybody who would even be interested in doing it with me. At that time, everybody thought that there's a nice linear relationship between intelligence and leadership and creativity and all that. And then, many years later, in 2016, this guy who's a professor at Lausanne in Switzerland says, I just ran across your article, and I've just collected some data that beautifully can test your theory. So are you willing to collaborate with me? I mean, obviously, I'll be a third author on it. He had a colleague at Penn State, not Penn State, University of Pennsylvania, House, who was on it too. And so the three of us tested a theory that I published in 1985. And it was beautiful because there's not too many times when a theory in psychology gives a point estimate. We'll say, this group will get a higher mean than this group, but we don't say what the mean will be. Okay. Well, my mathematical model, actually predicted the mean IQ for the person who emerges as the leader in the group. Okay. And it predicts it as 1.2 standard deviations of the mean IQ for the group. So it could be higher than 1.2 relative to the population. And it came out beautiful. We even tested what are the odds of this being a statistical fluke. And it's not a statistical fluke because the interval estimate was so small around the point estimate. So I couldn't have done that without this colleague, in Switzerland. And I guess he couldn't have done it without me because he was using my theory. So he had to give credit where credit was due. And I'll give you one more example. I mean, that's a very fine work. I mean, I really love that. And it was published as a lead article in the Journal of Applied Psychology. And it's one of my most cited articles published so recently, that is. Let me just give one more example. It was really kind of fun. I've done a lot of stuff where I've done single case studies of famous people. Like earlier I mentioned the study I did of Napoleon. And and I've done a lot of stuff on famous psychologists. I've even published an encyclopedia article on Francis Galton. Anyway, I had these two colleagues from Norway say, ask me, says, have you ever thought about applying the big five personality factors to B.F. Skinner? And I said, well, yeah, it just so happens I'm working on a project like that. And they said, well, so are we. And so we pooled our data and published this great paper where we actually estimate what his personality would be had he taken the big five personality inventory, and how in some respects he comes out as a typical scientist, but in other respects he comes out as a typical artist. And if you know anything about B.F. Skinner once aspired to become a creative writer and never succeeded. He was a failure.
So he wrote Walden
yeah,
too,
Walden too.
Later in his life.
In his life. That was, his attempt to at least get one novel published. And even then, a lot of people don't know this, the publisher was very reluctant to publish Walden 2 and said, okay, we'll publish it if you also write for us an introductory psych textbook. So it was a tit for tat thing. So he wasn't lucky when it came to being a creative writer.
Yeah, I assume for his profile, I would assume conscientiousness in him would be turned all the way up.
Yeah. I mean, he was anal compulsive.
Yeah.
He had a timer in his study, and they kept track how much his light over his desk was on. And then when he got a certain amount of time, it allowed him to go to, I think he had an organ. He used to have a piano, and now he later got an organ. And he would be able to play so much music because he loved to play music. But then he had a timer for that. And once he hit that time, he had to go back to his desk and start working. That is conscientiousness.
An interesting person. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, wonderful. And then final question. Who are three people, either living or dead, who you think are especially underrated? Three people whose work that you think should be better known.
Boy, that's kind of hard one to answer, partly because I've promoted a lot of people who I thought were underrated. Okay. Let me give you one example. There was this Frenchman. Well, actually, his family was from Switzerland, but he moved to Paris. And his name is Alphonse de Candolle. And he published the first scientific study of scientific genius. It was absolutely a brilliant study because he introduced, this was published in 1883, okay, long time ago. He introduced statistical controls that people just would not even think of at the time. Like, for example, one of the problems you have to deal with if you're going to rate scientists is the problem of ethnocentrism,
Hmm.
right? Everybody likes their own scientists more than your neighbor scientists. I mean, a good example of that is there was a big priority debate between Newton and Leibniz, or who invented calculus.
Hmm.
And no surprise, the British supported Newton,
Yep.
and the Continentals, particularly the Germans and the French, supported Leibniz. Okay, well, it turns out they were both right. You can't. It wasn't resolved. But in any case, he says, "Oh, how do I control for that?" Well, he says, "I'll only count a scientist as famous according to how many fellowships or honorary memberships he receives in foreign academies.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter how many he receives in his own nation. It has to be in a foreign academy." That was an amazing thing to do,
Hmm.
because it immediately ruled out all your country's local favorites. Okay.
Hmm.
And another thing he calculated everything per capita.
Hmm.
And of course, that was, now in retrospect, we know that's absolutely essential. Just like we talked before earlier about population in the case of Athens. He showed, for example, that France is one of the leaders in science and scientific genius, and until you do it per capita. And then all of a sudden, Switzerland comes out on top.
Hmm.
I mean, Switzerland is an amazing little country because it has a very small population, but on a per capita basis, it is supreme. And you see it in the Nobel laureates as well.
Hmm.
He couldn't use that date, of course, because the Nobel Prize later came in the 20th century. But it's amazing, amazing stuff. And he did all this stuff on what kind of environments, what kind of educational system, and so forth produces higher per capita output of great scientists.
Hmm.
It's in French.
Hmm.
And it's never been translated. And it's completely overlooked. And ironically, he even predicted that it would be overlooked.
Hmm.
He did, one of the studies he did in this book is the role of the language you use in publication and how that influences your impact on the field. And he predicted that even though at his time, French was considered to be a standard scientific language, he predicted that within, I forget exactly when, but sometime in the 20th century, it would be German and English that would be the standard of languages. And it's exactly what happened. He predicted the same fate for Italian. Italian was a major scientific language at the time. And then he says, and it's just because of pure population overload, And eventually, of course, English took over from German.
Yep.
From population overload.
And also post World War II, it didn't make sense to use German probably in the scientific world.
Yeah, there's a number of different factors. Bismarck, the famous German chancellor, he was once asked, "What worries you the most about Germany and German culture and whatever?" I've got the exact wording of the question, and he said that North America speaks English. What an odd thing to say.
Yeah.
But he was
Interesting.
right.
Well, it sort of goes back to this giving you access to a lot of these kind of different diversifying experiences that if you're part of a large cultural milieu, if you speak English, you can interact with a huge number of people.
So I already
Also,
answered. I gave you 1 out of 3. De Candolle, Alphonse de Candolle. Are you talking about people who contribute to my field, or are you talking about people who contribute to any field?
Can we do one of both?
Okay. Now, of course, the contribute to any field is a little bit more dangerous because that assumes I have expertise in that field that I may not have.
Maybe in an adjacent field.
In what?
In an adjacent field.
Adjacent field, yeah. Well, I've already blown it on Florence Price. It's hard to believe that it was not that long ago that no one even knew her music. It wasn't even performed, recorded, or whatever, till they found this box in this abandoned house. But I can't use her anymore because she's famous. Okay. It's what I would say is here's a Googling task for you. Google famous women scientists and then go through the list, and you'll get a long list.
You would hope.
And look at how many you don't recognize. Okay. And then look at their achievements and try to figure out what's wrong with you that you don't recognize them. Now, sometimes if you read their stories, you find out they were victims of sexism and, or in the case of different ethnicities, of, racism, because you can do the same thing for famous Black scientists. I have a t-shirt that I wear that's called Famous Black Scientists. Also a t-shirt I wear, Famous Women Scientists. And it has all these people who made incredible contributions, and contributions that you would know. Like I consider blood transfusions to be a big deal, save a lot of lives and so forth. The guy who came up with blood transfusions, I can't remember, Percy Drew, something like that. He, developed the whole technique, was necessary and effective, saved a lot of lives. But the irony is that, and also did the blood type. During World War I, or was it World War II? One of the world wars, when they actually applied this, it was World War II. They still segregated blood, black and white blood. So you had to be black to get black, white blood, and white to be white blood. Even though he had already shown scientifically that it made no difference whatsoever. So, I mean, just do the Google test, and you can also do Google neglected geniuses, and you get some really interesting people crop up. And that's probably a safer way of doing it than me going beyond my expertise,
Okay. And then for someone in your own field, is there anyone who particularly comes to mind? I thought you would say Catherine Cox.
I would say, that's interesting, Catherine Cox. I'm glad you mentioned her. She's one of my heroes. There's actually a webpage in it's called Feminist Voices, that deals with, kind of neglected women psychologists. And I've actually contributed historical articles to that webpage, because I've not only used her work, but I've also studied her biography and published on it, even interviewed her step-granddaughter. Okay. So she is one of my heroes. I even got in a little tiff recently at the last meeting of the American Psychological Association, because I read an article by this guy who just so happened to be delivering an invited address there, and I was the guy who invited him. And I didn't know that he had a negative opinion of Catherine Cox. And so there was a social hour, and I had probably one too many glasses of wine, and he had probably one too many beers. And I said, by the way, I totally disagree with what you said about Catherine Cox. And I kind of ripped into him a little bit on it. I shouldn't have done that. I should have been host. If you're host, you have to allow your invitee a certain amount of slack. So anyway, she was someone who kind of got a bum rap, because she did really great stuff. Her dissertation is her masterpiece. That's the one I've actually gone to Stanford Library and dug up the original data that she collected for her dissertation, and then also gone to the history of psychology, American psychology in Akron, to dig up some more of her data that she collected after dissertation, because she was going to do a follow-up study and published work off of that. And it's absolutely phenomenal, the work she put into that. Of course, she was bilingual. I mean, she was an amazing person, very erudite. But she had the misfortune of, and this is an example where collaboration is not a good idea. She had the misfortune of collaborating with her mentor, Louis Terman, on masculinity, femininity. And they actually devised a masculinity, femininity scale. And the problem is he had very stereotypical views about gender and sexuality. I mean, not only about women, but also about sexual orientation. I mean, you name it, it was all conventional, traditional views. And he basically had a tendency of trying to fit his data to fit his preconceptions. And she kept on saying, you can't do that, Louis. The data show that masculinity and femininity are far more complex than you think it is. And there are people who can score high, and there's people who score low, and there's some aspects that are left out. And so she wrote this chapter that summed up all the work, and then he left out in the final book. So she could have got credit for a major contribution. She was ahead of her time. And it wasn't until much later that they were able to dig up some of this stuff, and people were saying, this is what Catherine Cox really felt about masculinity and femininity, about gender and sexual orientation. So anyway, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned her, because she is one of my heroes. And and another way she got kind of shafted is she married a really nice guy. She was a Quaker. And she married a very nice Quaker. And then but unfortunately, he already had kids. So she instantly became a mom of teenagers overnight, right? And then, of course, they wanted to have children of their own. And even though she had a miscarriage or two, they did have two of their own. So she ended up with like 5 kids, something like that. That's a big family for an academic. Then he gets a job at Yale in the psychology department, and they have nepotism rules there. So she couldn't get a job in the psychology department. So she ends up getting a clinical position in a child clinical, as a child clinic. And was not the best place where you could do research. And she tried to do research while she was there, but she published very, very little. And she had no other choice, because she had a clinical load she had to deal with. And so his publications went up and her publications went down. So I think she got kind of shafted from, sexism and her mentor pulling rank on her, the patriarchal hierarchy,
Amazing. Well, Dr. Simonton, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with me and just sharing a bit about your work. I just want to convey to anyone who's listening that you should absolutely. Well, I should ask: are you? I saw that you're working on another book. Are you? Is there a time frame on that our listener might be able to expect?
That's a fantasy book.
Okay.
Yeah, when some years ago, I thought, I would really like to put all this together. But one thing I encountered I mean, basically, if you look at it, I posted the outline online. It covers all the topics I want to cover. Okay. The problem is I realized is the technical level would probably be too high if I covered them the way I'd want them to be covered. And what really sold me on that is when I published that book I mentioned earlier, Great Psychologists in Their Times. It didn't do very well. And in fact, what happened is it went out of print almost right away. It turns out it's still out of print, but it's still in print. Because it was published by the American Psychological Association, APA books. What they did is they decided to sell the separate chapters separately. So you can read the whole book, but you have to pay for each chapter separately. I think it costs $24 each, and it's, there's 18 chapters or whatever. They do give you the front matter and the back matter free, the index and the table of contents.
It's generous of them.
Right. But one of the problems I had is, and the review showed it, is it got too technical. I had Lotka's law in there, the actual equation and the predictions.
Yeah. Which is something I admire so much about your work, honestly. I mean, so a lot of it is a lot of reviews I see of your work is that it's drier, that it's analytical, and I think it's so refreshing in this domain.
Oh, thank you.
Because it's very it's very formal.
So guess what? My most recent book, obviously you have to pitch in my most recent book, The Genius Checklist, is actually that wish book, that fantasy book, with the stuff accessible to the average education layman included and everything else deleted.
Okay. Okay.
Because it covers much the same stuff, but it does it in an accessible way. And no wonder it's my most frequently translated book now, because it's so accessible. But on the other hand, a lot of the questions you asked me here are not answered in that book because they'd be too technical, like Lotka's law.
Right. Yeah.
We're talking about per capita and all that.
Right. Well, for any listeners who want a cursory look at your work, then the Genius Checklist is the place to go. And if they want to go deeper, looking at your Google Scholar is probably a good place to start.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff there.
Anyway, Dr. Simonton, I want to thank you again so much.
I loved
been
it.
An honor.
Yes, really great questions. And your last question was my favorite.
Wonderful. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Bye.